Imagine you are not born yet. You are about to arrive into a world that has no idea it will one day be called China. The land you are entering is a battlefield of kingdoms, 7 great powers and dozens of smaller ones, each with its own laws, its own gods, its own way of teaching a person what they are supposed to become. The world you are about to grow up in is ancient, complicated, and deeply human, and it is a world that, within a few generations, will be erased. Before that happens, there is a life to be lived. There are lessons to learn, rituals to survive, trades to inherit, marriages to endure, and a self to construct inside a society that has already decided, before you even drew breath, almost everything about who you will become. This is the story of what it meant to grow up in ancient China before there was a China at all. The first thing you need to understand is that the moment of birth determined almost everything, not because of superstition alone, though omens and divination were a constant presence in this world. What truly mattered was the family you were born into. In the Warring States period, those violent, brilliant, exhausting centuries between roughly 475 and 221 BCE, society was organized into 4 broad categories, a system the Chinese called Shi, Nong, Gong, and Shang. Scholars came first, farmers came second, artisans came third, merchants came last. These were not just social labels, they were destinies. They determined what you could learn, who you could marry, where you could live, and what kind of human being your world expected you to become. Most people were born into farming families, in villages scattered across the plains of what is now Hebei, Shandong, Shanxi, and the fertile valleys of the Huai and Wei rivers. The vast majority of the population lived and died as agricultural workers. The world of ancient China most people imagine, the scholars debating philosophy, the nobles feasting in lacquered halls. That world was the thin surface of a much larger, quieter reality. Beneath it, in the mud and the millet fields and the rammed earth courtyard houses, ordinary people lived lives shaped almost entirely by the rhythms of soil and sky and season. From the moment they were old enough to take on the full responsibilities of adult life, a threshold defined by specific ritual ceremonies we will return to. Every decision a person made was understood in relation to the family unit. You did not simply choose a trade, you inherited one. You did not simply find a partner. 2 families negotiated one. You did not simply become an adult. A ceremony declared you one, and without that ceremony, you were socially incomplete. When a family was expecting a new member, the preparation was not primarily emotional. It was ritual. The household would consult bone or milfoil divination, practices that had been central to Chinese life since at least the Shang dynasty, centuries before the Warring States period. Cracks were read in heated bones, or dried yarrow stalks were cast, and their patterns interpreted according to texts like the I Ching, the Book of Changes. The question was not simply whether the birth would go well. The question was what kind of person this would be, and what kind of future the heavens were pointing toward. The household into which a person was born was almost certainly a multi-generational compound. In the states of Zhao and Wei, and in much of the agricultural heartland, extended families lived together in clusters of rooms built around a central courtyard, the walls made of rammed earth, the roofs tiled or thatched depending on the family's resources. At the center of daily existence stood the ancestral altar, a simple wooden tablet or series of tablets inscribed with the names of the dead, before which offerings of food and incense were made at regular intervals throughout the year. This ancestral altar was not decorative. It was the most important piece of furniture in the house. The dead were not gone in this world. They were present, observant, and capable of bringing fortune or misfortune upon the living depending on how carefully they were honored. Every significant event in a household, a birth, a death, a marriage, the beginning of planting season, a journey of any distance, required a ritual acknowledgement at the ancestral altar. A person growing up in this world would have absorbed this not as a taught belief, but as an obvious daily fact. The boundary between the living and the dead was permeable in a way that shaped the emotional texture of ordinary existence. Beyond the household walls, the social world was ordered with remarkable precision. Local officials kept records of households, land holdings, and able-bodied adults subject to taxation and military conscription. The bureaucratic reach of these states was, by the standards of the ancient world, quite sophisticated. A family was not invisible to the state. It was known, counted, taxed, and occasionally conscripted. Grain taxes took a portion of every harvest. Corvée labor duties required households to send workers for state construction projects, walls, canals, roads, sometimes for weeks at a time. And military conscription, which intensified dramatically during the Warring States period as the great kingdoms mobilized massive armies, could take a household's able-bodied members and not return them at all. This shadow was part of what it meant to grow up in this world. A young person learning the rhythms of the farming year was simultaneously learning which parts of that year could be interrupted by state demand and which could not. Within this world of agricultural households and state demands, there existed a class of people who occupied a space between the farming majority and the noble elite. These were the shy. Originally, the word referred to warriors, the trained fighters who rode chariots and held the line between noble privilege and common life. But during the Warring States period, as the nature of warfare changed and mass infantry armies replaced the old chariot aristocracy, the meaning of Shu began to shift. It came to describe something closer to educated men, people who had enough learning to serve as administrators, scribes, advisors, or teachers, defined less by birth than by training. This shift was genuinely remarkable. It was one of the most important social transformations in Chinese history. And it happened quietly, through the accumulation of individual decisions made in households and courts across the 7 kingdoms. In the state of Lu, a small kingdom in what is now Shandong province, famous above all for producing Confucius, private schools became increasingly common. A man like Confucius himself, who lived in the city of Khufu and reportedly taught thousands of students over his lifetime, represented a new kind of social figure. The private teacher who would accept students based on willingness to learn rather than birth alone. This created something new, a pathway, narrow and difficult, but real, by which a person of modest birth could gain the knowledge that opened the door to government service. This was not a meritocracy in any modern sense. Birth still largely determined who had the leisure to pursue education. The son of a farmer who spent every daylight hour in the fields could not simultaneously memorize the Book of Odes or study the ritual texts of the Zhou, but the son of a minor official or a family that had scraped together enough surplus to keep one son in school, that son had a chance, and that chance, if taken, could lead to a life radically different from the one his grandfather had lived. The curriculum of these private schools was centered on what would later become the Confucian classics. The Book of Odes, a collection of songs and poetry, was both a literary text and a political one. Knowing it demonstrated cultural refinement, the Book of History contained accounts of the ancient kings and their governance. The Book of Rites laid out the elaborate behavioral codes governing every social interaction, from the correct way to greet a superior to the precise order of ritual gestures at a funeral. Music, archery, chariot driving, mathematics, and calligraphy rounded out the 6 arts, the complete education of an accomplished person. Learning to write was not simple. The Chinese script of the Warring States period was not standardized. Each of the 7 kingdoms had developed its own variant forms of characters. The script used in Qin was noticeably different from that used in Chu or Qi. A scribe trained in one state might struggle to read documents from another. This fragmentation of the written language was one of the things Qin would later force into uniformity. But in the years before unification, it was simply part of the landscape of a plural world, and growing up in it meant that your education was, in a real sense, your kingdom's education. You read its script. You learned its songs. You understood its particular version of the past. The most famous educational institution of the entire Warring States period was the Jixia Academy in Linzi, the capital of the state of Qi, in what is now Shandong province. Established around 360 BCE under the sponsorship of the Qi royal family, the Jixia Academy was a state-funded gathering place for scholars from across the known world. Thinkers representing every major philosophical tradition, Confucians, Taoists, Mohists, legalists, cosmologists, debated, argued, wrote, and taught in an atmosphere of extraordinary intellectual energy. Mencius came here. Zunzi spent time here. Zhu Yan, who developed the theory of the five elements, worked here. The academy represented the peak of what the plural intellectual culture of the Warring States period could produce. It was closed after unification, when Qin banned private teaching entirely. For most people, of course, Linzi and its academy were as distant as the moon. The education a person received was not in any school. It was in the household, the workshop, and the field. A young person born into an artisan family learned their craft by watching and assisting. In Zhou and Warring States China, social rank, occupation, and cultural identity were generally inherited together. The son of a bronzesmith became a bronzesmith. The daughter of a weaver learned to weave. The son of a potter shaped clay. These were not just economic arrangements. They were identities transmitted through years of proximity and imitation, living in the hands and the eyes and the body long before they were ever conscious choices. This meant that craft knowledge was deeply personal and deeply familial. The techniques for producing fine lacquerware, that black and red resin art that the Warring States period raised to extraordinary heights, were passed from master to apprentice within families and workshops over generations. The silk weavers of Qi, whose products were traded across the known world, carried their knowledge in the precise tension of the loom and the recognition of quality in the thread. This knowledge had no textbook. It lived in bodies, and when those bodies were conscripted into armies or relocated by imperial decree, that knowledge was interrupted in ways that no administrative order could fully repair. And then there was the moment when the body itself was declared adult. For men of the educated classes, scholars, minor officials, members of the Shi, the transition to adulthood was marked by a ceremony called the Guan Li, the capping ceremony. According to the Book of Rites, this was typically performed at age 20 in the ancestral temple. The young man's hair, worn loose until this point, would be gathered and bound, and a series of 3 caps, representing different aspects of adult life, placed on his head by a respected elder chosen specifically for the occasion. The date was set through divination. After the ceremony, the young man received a courtesy name, a formal public name, separate from the childhood name his family had always called him, signaling that he was now a social being with public responsibilities. The courtesy name was not a small thing. In a world where personal names carried deep meaning and where calling someone by their childhood name in public was an act of intimacy reserved for close family, the courtesy name was a declaration of transformation. It said, "This person has crossed a threshold. He is no longer simply a member of a household. He has a role in the world." For women, the equivalent ceremony was called the Jili, the hairpin ceremony. A respected married woman, chosen for her virtue and social standing, would pin up the young woman's hair with a ceremonial hairpin, signaling her passage into adulthood and her readiness for marriage. The Book of Rites set the typical age at 15, though the ceremony was often timed to coincide with betrothal. After the Li, women of the educated and noble classes were expected to learn the conduct appropriate to their new status, the correct way to address elders, the management of household ritual, the skills of weaving and embroidery considered essential feminine accomplishments. What is striking about both ceremonies is how completely they located the individual within a web of social obligation. These were not personal milestones in any modern sense. They were not celebrations of individual growth or self-discovery. They were declarations of social readiness. Announcements made before the ancestors and the community that this person was prepared to take up their role in the system the world required, and the most consequential role, certainly for women and significantly for men, was marriage. The systemization of marriage rituals in ancient China is credited by historians to scholars of the Warring States period. The texts that governed marriage described a process of 6 formal steps: the initial proposal, the exchange of birth dates for compatibility matching through divination, formal betrothal with gifts, the presentation of wedding gifts, the selection of an auspicious wedding date through consultation with an astrologer, and finally, the ceremony itself. This process required months, and its fundamental logic was constant across all social levels. Marriage was not primarily about the 2 people being joined. It was about 2 families forming an alliance. The boy's family sent betrothal gifts to the girl's family as a formal acknowledgement of her value and her parents' investment in raising her. By accepting those gifts, the girl's family pledged her to the boy's household. This agreement was binding. The bride, once she entered her husband's household, was joining his family rather than simply his person. She came under the authority of his parents, particularly his mother. The relationship between a new bride and her mother-in-law was one of the most fraught and consequential bonds in ancient Chinese life, one that literature and philosophy returned to repeatedly, because it was where enormous power was concentrated and contested in the intimate space of the household. A young woman's position in her husband's family was not fixed. It could improve with the birth of sons, with demonstrated virtue and competence in household management, and with time, as the mother-in-law aged, and the bride eventually became the senior woman of the household herself. But in the early years, her situation was often one of significant vulnerability. Far from her own family, bound by obligations she had no part in negotiating, dependent on her ability to navigate a new social world with very little room for error. Men faced their own pressures. A man of the farming or artisan classes was expected to manage a household, land, animals, tools, relationships with neighbors and officials. From early adulthood, the grain taxes had to be paid regardless of whether the harvest had been good. Corvée labor could be demanded at the worst moments. Military conscription could arrive without warning. And in the Warring States period, the weight of that last threat was enormous. Armies in this era numbered in the hundreds of thousands, figures that would have been unimaginable to an earlier age. States mobilized their entire populations. Total warfare in this context meant exactly what it says. The farmer became a soldier. The craftsman became a soldier. The newly capped adult, fresh from his Guanli ceremony, could find himself marching toward a distant battlefield within the year. This is rarely discussed in the way it deserves. The military texts of the Warring States period are sophisticated and famous. Sun Tzu's Art of War, the strategies of the great commanders. But these were written for officers and rulers. The ordinary conscript, the farmer who became a soldier, left almost no direct record. What we know comes from archaeology, the mass graves, the skeletal remains with healed and unhealed wounds, the official registers tracking households with missing adult males. History remembers the strategy, the bodies it forgets. In the great cities of the Warring States kingdoms, the texture of growing up was different. Linzi, the capital of Qi, was by some ancient accounts one of the most densely populated cities in the world during the 3rd century BCE. The streets of Linzi were a marketplace of visible social complexity. Silk merchants, bronze dealers, salt traders, healers, fortune tellers, musicians, and scholars arguing near the Jixia Academy. To grow up in Linzi was to grow up observing every level of the social hierarchy simply by walking through a market. This exposure did not erase the hierarchy, but it made its workings legible in a way that village life could not. The city of Handan, capital of Zhao in what is now Hebei province, had a different character. More military, more austere, shaped by its position near the northern steppe. Zhao had adopted cavalry tactics earlier than most kingdoms. following reforms that required soldiers to abandon traditional Chinese robes and wear the fitted clothing of the nomads. A change so culturally jarring that it was recorded in historical sources as a moment of profound discomfort. To grow up in Handan was to grow up aware of the world beyond the Chinese cultural sphere in a way that most people, in most places, did not experience. What no one could escape, regardless of birth or city, was the philosophical atmosphere of the age. The Warring States period was one of the most intellectually extraordinary moments in human history. The time of the 100 schools of thought. Confucians insisted social order depended on ritual propriety and benevolent governance. Taoists argued that deep wisdom lay not in social convention, but in attunement to the natural flow of things. Mohists called for universal love and the rejection of aggressive warfare. Legalists maintained that human nature was self-interested and that only clear laws and severe punishments could produce a functioning state. These were not academic debates held in distant academies. They were competing visions of what life should look like, and growing up in this period meant growing up inside that argument. A farming household near the Wei River in Qin would not be reading philosophical texts, but the farmers of that household felt the effects of legalist policy directly. In the household registration systems, in the collective punishment laws that made neighbors responsible for each other's conduct, in the state rewards for military achievement that allowed a commoner to rise in rank through battlefield valor. The abstract ideas of philosophers had been turned into the concrete texture of daily life. You did not need to know the name Han Feizi to live inside his theory. And then, in 221 BCE, the world ended. Or rather, a world ended. The plural, fractious, endlessly various world of the Seven Kingdoms. And something new was imposed in its place. Qin's conquest of the remaining kingdoms was swift and total. Han fell in 230 BCE, Zhao in 228 BCE, Wei and Chu in 223 BCE, Yan in 222 BCE, and Qi, the last, in 221 BCE. In each case, the political institutions of the conquered state were dismantled. The royal families were removed. The noble lineages that had governed for generations were uprooted. Historical sources record that tens of thousands of noble families from the conquered territories were forcibly relocated to Qin's heartland, where they could be watched and their local influence neutralized. The local scripts were replaced by the Qin standard. Local coins were melted down and replaced. Local weights and measures were standardized. The philosophical schools that had thrived at the Jixia Academy were suppressed. Private teaching was forbidden under imperial policy. And in one of the most infamous acts of the new empire, a vast burning of books was ordered. The texts of history, philosophy, and poetry that the various kingdoms had accumulated over centuries were consigned to the flames. What did all of this mean for someone who had grown up in those kingdoms? It meant that the world in which their identity had been formed, the kingdom whose name had been their home, whose laws had structured their obligations, whose cultural traditions had taught them what it meant to be a person, had been declared officially over. The merchants of Qi, who had grown up learning the coastal trade routes of the eastern states, using the distinctive coins of their kingdom, conducting business in the regional script, they had to start over. The scholars educated in the tradition of the Jixia Academy found the tradition they had inherited was no longer legal to teach. The most ordinary people experienced the change less as cultural erasure and more as administrative replacement. The tax collectors still came. The labor levy still arrived. The conscription system still reached into households. But now the authority behind these demands was different. It was no longer the kingdom they had been born into. It was an empire that had not existed when they were young. What survived was something harder to name. The ancestral tablets in the household courtyard still bore the names of the dead. The graves were still visited at the proper seasons. The body knowledge of the silk weaver, the bronzesmith, the potter was still in their hands, and still passed from those hands to the next generation. The habits of daily existence, the seasonal round, the patient management of soil and family, these were too deep to be erased by administrative order. But the sense of belonging to something specific, a kingdom, a tradition, a plural world of competing ideas and local identities. That was harder to maintain under an empire that regarded plurality as a problem to be solved. History records the names of the kings and the dates of the battles. It preserves the edicts of the first emperor and the policies of his officials. What it does not preserve, except in fragments and inference, is the texture of what it meant to grow up in 7 different worlds, to learn a specific script, use a specific coin, hear a specific philosophical argument in a market street, and be declared an adult in a ceremony performed before the ancestors of a kingdom that would be gone before you were old. The people who lived through that transformation never knew they were living through the end of something. They knew only that the world was changing faster than they could make sense of it. They continued doing what people always do: waking up, working, eating, honoring the dead, raising the next generation, hoping for something better. They did not know they were the last people who would ever grow up in a world before the empire. And everything we understand about what came after, about the civilization that endured for 2,000 years, rests on the foundation of what they experienced and what they lost. If this is what it meant to grow up before China became one empire, then the question of what it meant to be born after, to have no memory of a world with more than one answer to the question of what it meant to be Chinese, that is a stranger and more difficult question still.